What's the problem with the list?
Sometimes it reveals that there's more desires that need to be met than funds available to meet those desires, which is scary from a contractor standpoint.
Yeah. Anybody have a junk drawer at home? Or one of those
Just
closets
growing,
that you,
right?
yeah, it just keeps growing and growing and growing. What happens after you get about, I don't know, 7, 10 items down on the list to your mental capacity?
Throw it away.
Yeah, we start dismissing it, right?
Yeah,
It just starts becoming,
everything.
it just starts becoming this never-ending list. And so that's one of the things around ordering a backlog that we try to look at, because if you've got some things on there that are never going to happen, we want you to organize that junk drawer. We want you to start thinking about that list being something that's actually realistic and manageable. Now, the whole idea of prioritization and agility is leading us to the goal, which is predominant in Scrum, and it's this idea of getting something done. It's the whole idea. That's why we do anything in an agile manner. We want to get something out to market to show value sooner. Now, there's been a ton of studies, depending on which survey that you look at. It used to be that this idea of using a waterfall process versus an agile process, there was a vast, vast difference. But, you know, even in the last 5 years, even waterfall projects can be very successful if they're done in very small chunks. So really small batch sizes, getting something out there of value, whether you use a sequential process or whether you use an agile process, the secret sauce is getting something of value out there quickly. And so when we talk about business agility, we really think about a future where the second phase is not going to happen. So we want to deliver something every single time we have a slice of an initiative that is of value. Now, your backlog could look like this. There could be a bunch of foundational work that's in play, but particularly in Scrum, the whole point of Scrum is that you get even a small piece of functionality out there with that first initiative. We act as if that second phase will never happen, because the idea is that you would get feedback or the market changes and you have to respond to that change. You guys are supporting the EPA. I suspect there's all kinds of things that happen out of the blue that aren't planned for. And the idea of business agility is that you can pivot, that you've delivered something of value and that your funding could be cut or the initiative could be changed after every single initiative, but you've delivered something of value and it's okay. You can pivot and move on to that next fire, if you will. Maybe a little too close to home for you guys. Has anybody ever read the book Speed of Trust from Covey? Speed of Trust, it's just a really interesting, if you could, sometimes I get sick of reading Agile books, so I like behavioral sciences and some other things that are related, but the Speed of Trust really talks about when we deliver results, trust comes. Results first, and then trust comes. And so one of the great things about using Agile frameworks is that you're delivering something of value quickly. And if you can't put something out there that's feature related, sometimes our customers get a little frustrated with us because they don't see what we're building. Think about if you've ever had a house remodeled or kitchen remodeled or a house built. There's a ton of infrastructure that's going into place, particularly if you want that, you know, fancy kitchen, or you want to, you know, say that you as a homeowner want to have a soaking tub or whirlpool tub. There might be some infrastructure in plumbing or electric that has to be in place. We don't really care about that as consumers. We want the tub, or we want the fancy oven or the double oven, right? We know that the infrastructure has to be there, but it's hard to make us care about that, because what we care about are the things that we can use and see. So an example of this, I was working for a company. We were doing some data analytics, a dashboard. We were using schools who had won some grant money from Bill Gates and a couple of other grants out there to build these leadership dashboards for schools. Now, it takes almost a year to get the grant money awarded, and then it takes another year to get the statement of works and the proposals to a point where the company can actually start delivering on this. So 2 years in, the selected school districts gets to finally work on this dashboard and pull all this data together so that they can identify high-performing teachers, and they can reward those teachers with this grant money. This company I was working with, we had 3-week sprints. It's data and analytics. We had a ton of foundational stuff that we had to provide. So the first sprint went by. We were very happy. We had put so much of this foundational stuff into play. Came to the review, had nothing to show. It's all foundational stuff. went away, came back the next sprint. We were really happy because we had really accomplished a bunch of stuff with our architecture and put a bunch of automation in place, had nothing really to show. What do you think might be happening in that school district 2 years in to getting to this process started, now 6 weeks into the process, and we're not showing them anything? What do you think their customer satisfaction level was? Yeah, pretty frustrated, pretty angry, and they were worried, a lot of fear, right? They had spent 2 years fighting to get to this point. They're not going to be able to get this, grant again. Time is ticking, and we hadn't shown anything. So we, luckily they were pretty vocal about that. We were able to pivot. Even a very small slice of functionality starts to build trust. And that's really what we're trying to do with Scrum in particular, is build some functionality every single feature. So wading through all the chafe and thinking about what we can prioritize is in combination with getting something to done. What is that small slice of something that we can get to done? So the idea is that if you've got dependencies, either they get resolved before the sprint, or you get the people on your team to resolve those dependencies inside the sprint, so that you can actually get something to a point where it's being done. Any reactions or comments on that? Okay, so let's talk about how. Yes.
No, I really like that, Julie, the thought of results equals trust. That's a great thing. I'm writing that down.
Yeah, and it doesn't take a lot, right? I mean, even a small little feature starts to show people what you're actually working on, and it starts to build that. And then we get them focusing on the feature that we are delivering, and they can start telling us the changes that they need and the value that they're seeing from that. So that little, even a small little bit of feature. So your backlog could look like this. Your release backlog could look like this, but always pretending that something's going to happen and that you need to pivot. You may not get that second phase. So that comes into play when we're talking about prioritization. So let's talk about some of those techniques. So has anybody ever heard of the Hippo Technique? The highest paid person's opinion. Does this ever happen? Got one person nodding.
Sure, sure.
Yeah. This is when that senior person or a leader decides what should be delivered, right? Regardless of what's happening. Let's just talk about pros and cons of this. What are some pros? Are there any pros?
I mean, on the one hand, if the top dog is happy, project's money keep flowing.
They're seeing their results.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just a clear vision can help.
Yeah.
And sometimes they're right. Has anybody ever really worked with a really brilliant, their instincts, despite what the evidence might be telling them, they choose another direction and they end up being right because they've got really good experience in that place and they've got good instincts, right? So it's not all bad. Say again?
Frank should raise his hand.
Frank, are you a hippo? Or you're just a SME with great, with some great instincts and experience?
I'm just a SME, yeah.
You're just a SME. So it's not all bad, right? But let's talk about some of those cons. What could be things that go wrong if we're relying on someone's opinion?
I mean, I think for me, this is where I was thinking of the politics, right? So one day the highest paid person's boss wants this, and then 2 weeks later they want that, and we've seen the team whiplashed back and forth, and then we never really, quote unquote, get anything done.
Yeah. I love this little cartoon from Google. Can everybody read that? So Google, being a data-driven company, obviously, they're a big proponent of using data to help make decisions. I don't think they came up with the term Hippo, but that's one, when we're talking about ways that we could shift the approach, data is one way. Tell me about that. Tell me, if you've got a Hippo situation happening, what are some things that could help shift that decision making?
I'm thinking the thing that pops into my head, Cheryl, is the travel app and how management really wanted this application, which was awesome, but it was one of those, okay, dive in, start going, you have to go, you have to figure it out. And if it was purely our project and purely our say, I think we would have done more research at the onset and known some of the limitations before we ended up with a budget and a scope that ballooned. Like we would have, in my mind, would have planned differently and known what our limits were and set expectations better, as opposed to kind of being forced to jump in and start working.
Thanks. In the product world, we call that outside-in thinking. So we often come up with great ideas when we're sitting around a table, and we often have great instincts and experience in the field, and we make decisions sitting around a table. What we want to do in product is validate those decisions, validate those assumptions in some way in the discovery process before we jump into development, and it doesn't take a whole lot. So when we talk about ordering the backlog, there's some implication of putting some of that analysis to play. What we try to encourage is get some kind of access to customers and data. It doesn't take a lot. Has anybody ever heard of this book called How to Measure Anything? Now I'm going to warn you, it's a textbook, but it's a really fabulous book to get you thinking about how to quantify different business cases. It's kind of up to my business analysis game, if you will. It's really talking about how even a little bit of data, if you go back to, if you took any kind of statistics courses in school, or you're a student of economics, even a little bit of data can help paint a picture that can present you more choices. So when we talk about slicing and ordering a backlog, even a little bit of data can validate an assumption or can force a pivot. So data can start to build a story for you that helps to justify not just the order of the backlog, but really thinking about what we call that minimum viable product or minimum viable prototype. Is really from a product world where we like to get. What's the smallest amount of effort that we can do to validate an assumption? Because any kind of value is just a guess until it gets into the hands of our users. Now, sometimes data doesn't feel really apparent to us, especially I live in a consulting world, so sometimes getting my hands on my users' data or my customers' data is really difficult. But I've learned to get really creative over time about my questions and to think about what data is happening in the organization that I can utilize. So an example of that, I was working for a tax software company. They're one of these companies that has little kiosks in stores. You can go and get your taxes done. You know, like while you're shopping, you can go in, sit down, they'll do your taxes right there on the fly. I wanted to get access to customer data, and they were very reluctant to let a consultant have any access to customer data. But I needed to see what was happening, you know, how people were actually, not just the person getting their taxes done, but the person using the software, because we were getting ready to rebuild this entire, you know, platform of this. And, you know, I was working for this company for almost a year when I found out that 100 yards away down the street, they had a training center where the new accountants were coming in and they were doing people's taxes for free in order to learn the system and the software. So if I could have been asking the right questions, it was right there. I could have gone in and just observed this training center and learned some of those friction points that we're looking for when we're wanting to build something new. I kept asking the wrong questions over and over and over again. So I had to expand, like, what could that data, what could that access to customers look like? Sometimes I work with clients where we've got customers inside of our own shops. You know, I've worked for automotive related companies. Everybody drives a car or buys a used car, right? Has anybody worked for, do any of your clients have people inside their shops where they actually might be users or customers? Maybe they have a relative working in the field that you're working with. Is there anybody like that that's sort of on the peripheral of your main user that you could tap into?
I think it varies project to project, but to a certain extent, yeah.
Yeah, so we typically have a lot more access than we think of if we start getting creative about talking about what that access to data and access to customers look like. So if you have an absence of data, what could you do if you literally have no data? You could build a backlog of getting data, right? Part of your backlog could be, what is an experiment that I can do, or what is something that I could do to start to collect that data? So in the meantime, you might be using that Hippo technique, but you want to start building that data story, that evidence story, to help build this conversation, because Hippo only works, you know, in limited amounts of scenarios. Maybe if you are under a crisis, you know, you deal with some natural disasters and some other things. Sometimes in a crisis, you have to make a decision based on instinct, and that's okay. That's fine. But it doesn't scale, right? Like that's really determined by, if you really get down to risk and value, that's really determined by one person. That's me's expertise and instincts, and people being able to trust that somehow this person is always right. That doesn't scale. And so we want to introduce you to some techniques that you can use as you go forward, that hopefully they will scale. What are some other ways that you guys think about ordering your own backlog in real life?
Sometimes I just like to do stuff that's fun.
I don't mind that. I like the way you think. Gotta sprinkle some of that in there. Any others?
Expressed short-term need of end users.
Yeah, that's great. The urgency, sure. All of those things that we talked about in the beginning, when we talked about, you know, limited resources, limited time, you're probably applying some of those techniques, I'm guessing, to your backlog. In your world, I couldn't pick just one prioritization technique to do a deep dive on, because your world is so broad. You have so many, it depends. And that's really what it comes down to in the world of prioritization. There isn't a one size fits all that's going to address all of your challenges. So we're going to introduce you to a few. So we've talked, you know, if you're thinking back to that first conversation, we call that the Moscow method, the must have, should have, would have. We're going to talk about the matrix family, Kano, something called heart metrics, and then the last one will be called cost of delay. All right, in the Zoom chat, I've put that link. If you were on early, you might have been able to download this handout. But if not, it should be in your Zoom chat. It'll look like this. You can, if you don't want to download it, if you don't have another screen, you can just make a little sketch on your notepad or at your desk, just a little matrix. As we go through the rest of this conversation, I want to use this matrix. I want you to start aligning these methods that we're going to talk about along this matrix, if they're easy and fast, against how much data that you need. So we've done the first one for you, that Hippo technique. It's very realistic, happens all the time. It's pretty easy and fast, just relies on that one person, and it's pretty qualitative. Would you guys agree with where this Hippo sticky is positioned? I will show the key at the end, so it'll prompt some good discussions. So as we go through each one of these techniques, I just want you to apply them to this matrix. So you could do it now, and then you can check your work later. So Hippo, pretty easy and fast, almost entirely qualitative, based on some kind of experience, and sometimes even against the evidence. All right, so let's go on. I mentioned this word Moscow. Has anybody ever heard this as a formal technique? Must have, should have, won't? Yeah. We do this all the time, thinking about those exercises we did in the very beginning, right? How we prioritize our limited time and resources, limited funds. We're probably typically in our daily life thinking about the things we must do, and then we're always thinking about, there's always things that we just know we're not gonna do. When you use Moscow, this is a pretty easy technique. When you use it, you can easily identify the must-haves and the will-not-haves. And then you can just spend your time talking about the two in the middle. So this is a relatively lightweight, very, very common technique. You can codify this. You can put some value numbers behind it. It's typically, typical use of this happens when you have limited time or resources. So what kind of data? What kind of data would help you with this? Does it require data? Jenny's giving me the face. Probably not a whole lot of data is really required. Could be some. What about the people? Who would you include in this conversation? Is this something you would do in a vacuum? Could you do this all by yourself?
That sounds like a negotiation between the dev team and the stakeholders. Is this even feasible? if it's not technically something that we could do, then it, you know, may or may not be included, but then also who's defining what a product must have would have to be stakeholders, product owner.
Yeah, that's an excellent ad. I can't tell you any other ads on this. As I was looking, just refreshing stuff around Moscow, I found there's a company out there, they have these little cards. Do you guys use something called like planning poker when you're sizing things? Has anybody ever heard of planning poker? A couple of you are now, where you're literally kind of sizing things, like using these little cards, and you're doing it all the time. They have these little cards, these little Moscow cards, and they're using it like planning poker. So it's a little bit of, it's opinion based, right? But it's a way to kind of get that without, you know, influencing other people's thinking. So I thought that was kind of fun. And I could even envision doing this in a remote team, everybody having their little cards, and as you're going through a backlog, everybody flashing them at one time. So I thought that was just kind of envisioning how you could use that in a remote environment. I thought that would be a kind of a fun technique. So when would you use Moscow? Give me an example of sometimes that you feel Moscow would be the right technique for you to use.
It seems like when the team is big enough to include all of those, like, I want to say positions, but like when we have stakeholders or multiple stakeholders, and we have a product owner and we have a dev team that's a size enough to have that conversation.
I think it's definitely helpful to have multiple perspectives. I don't know if that's an absolute, but I think it's helpful. It gives you a more robust answer. What about the type of initiative or project that you would use this technique on? Think about those examples, those warm-up examples.
I'm thinking,
Maybe if you have a lot of items to sift through, and you just, you know, they want everything. It's like, okay, well, let's go through this.
Yeah, when you're really getting things down to like must-haves, that's an easy way to sort stuff all the way to the top, right? Must-have, I would say, is often commonly used when you have time-boxed releases. When you really are thinking about, you have a limited time to do something, and in your world, that timing might be a very realistic constraint. So a lot of times I might work with compliance or SOX audits, things like that, and there's a deadline, right? There's something that I have to do with my team in order to meet an external force. So it's a time box release. So that really pushes those must-haves to the surface pretty quickly. So time boxed releases are often when you have an absolute deadline, the only thing that's negotiable in agility really is either time or scope. And if you have a deadline, like a compliance or regulatory deadline, that's going to push this Moscow technique, that's going to push those must-haves right to the surface. All right, any ads on this? So go back to your matrix now, if you downloaded that matrix, and think about this conversation. How much data does it need, and how easy is this to do? And put that on your matrix. We'll check in on the answers at the end. So we love matrices when we're prioritizing. You're using one, right? That idea of having those two axes is just a pretty common matrix, and we're just applying, you know, effort against data, just two dimensions. This is a pretty common one, the effort impact grid. Just another type of a matrix. It's got two axes. It's got that effort versus the impact, the value to your customer. What kind of data would this require? Who would you start asking questions of? How do you determine effort?
Testing.
Say again?
The developers.
Yeah, you definitely need your developers in this one, right? If you're thinking about effort, you're going to need the people who are closest to the work involved in this conversation. So where with Moscow, I think it's really helpful with effort impact, the people who are supplying the effort really become imperative. So as a product person, I might use Moscow first, you know, with a very small group. Maybe I don't have my developers when I'm initially building a backlog, but as I go forward, when I start getting into a little, like thinking about those should have, could haves, maybe this effort impact grid would be another layer of prioritization that I could use now with my developers in place. Could you guys see that progression of conversation happening with different audiences? When we talk about that, that impact, who's giving us data about impact? Which kind of audiences?
Users.
The users, yeah. Who are the users in your world? Let's talk about the difference between customers and users. Do you have customers and users?
Oh, certainly.
Yes, yeah. So in your world, who would give you some information around the impact? Either or both?
Usually users, just thinking like what time or energy are we saving them? What are their issues that we're trying to solve to begin with?
Sure.
Yeah, mainly users, but certainly a customer as well, depending on their position.
Right, yeah, and the problem that they're trying to solve, right? So when you're thinking about the effort and the data that goes into this type of a matrix, go ahead and mark this on your matrix. How much effort, how much data would this take? And when would you use this? When would you use the effort impact grid? Somebody mentioned, go ahead.
Oh, I mean, when you're to the point where you have an idea of what, I guess when you're sitting at the table and you have an understanding of what needs to get done, and maybe you have ordered your work and you need to figure out, okay, how much effort does each item take?
Yeah, and so you're asking others. So when you get to a point where you can benefit from the collective wisdom of the group, this is a great technique to use, because now you're adding in another dimension, right? So you can start to see how you can use pieces of different prioritization techniques even throughout the elaboration of your requirements. You may use something like Moscow just when you're thinking about that high level stuff, but as you get down into more granularity, you need to start bringing in these other perspectives. You might have environmental specialists that you have to bring in. You might have developers that you're bringing in. You might want to bring in this focus group of what this impact looks like, particularly if you have a ton of stuff to do. So if you're thinking about this matrix and you're starting to put these in these quadrants, this is physically what it looks like. So you can imagine online, even if you use something as simple as Google Slides, right? And you just build a quadrant. Are you guys using any kind of online collaboration tool?
Teams.
Is there anything that you can do something like this in Teams, like sort of put your items in a gallery and drag them into the quadrants as you talk?
They haven't enabled the whiteboard feature.
So that might be something that you practice. You can practice this. If you have a Gmail account, I don't know if you guys use Gmail or something like that, you can practice this with pretty much any kind of online collaboration technique, right? So you're just going to add your stuff in a gallery, and then as you talk about them, just pull them over. I actually even will open this up for people so that they can have their individual one before the day we get together, because I want to see what they come up with without the group think. So I might send them their own individual slide with the gallery around the bottom, and then they drag it into the categories that they think, and then we will put them together. Now, when I've had a little trick that I've done, a fun little trick is when I just use a PowerPoint slide and I get their feedback, I can stack those images on top of each other with some transparency, and I can actually kind of build a heat map. So you can be really creative, even online, by making this collaboration technique visual. The best thing about these matrices is that you're visualizing your thinking so that others can critique it. Now, the number one rule about matrices is you can't straddle a line. You got to commit. In this instance, which quadrant would you be working from? Let's say you've done that collaboration, you've gotten that data, everybody's had those conversations. Which quadrant starts to form the top of your backlog?
the top left.
Well, yeah.
Maybe. Let's go back to your world. Is it always going to be the top left? Could it be you might need to have some things that are high effort and high impact?
I was gonna say, I feel like that would sort into the category of being able to show effort in a first sprint. So depending on like what the users or stakeholders were most excited about.
Yeah. So that's one thing to do. So when you look at these matrix, I just want to encourage you to use them for the problem that you're solving. Now, typically people might say, okay, well, I'm going to go high left. This little graph says high left, like use that high left, but maybe not. Maybe there's going to be high effort, but you need to use these upper right quadrant. So the purpose of using a matrix is literally just to visualize that thinking, think about the problem that you're solving, and then use it in a way that makes sense for you. The thing is, you just have to make sure that everybody is level set on that, right? So if you've got limited time, limited resources, maybe low effort is the deciding factor. That's often the de facto, that's often where we start. But I just want to lean in from a product perspective that it might be high effort, but sometimes that impact is so enormous, you decide to do that anyway. So this is really just a visualization technique. Nobody good with that? Now, the easy thing is you can pretty easily take out the no's, right? If it's high effort, low impact, that's an easy way. You got 90 items in your backlog, you can probably drop off a number of them that end up in this bottom quadrant. Now, the great thing about matrix, I could probably show you 10 different examples of matrices. Has anybody used other matrices? Anybody ever, go ahead. Michael, you just went off mute.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question. If you're reviewing this collectively and there's conflict, so if I say, oh, this is really easy to do, and someone else says, no, it's not, and there's conflict, how do you resolve conflict?
So do you need to resolve the conflict at this point in time? Could you err on the side of conservative and go with the high effort, spend some time getting more data, and come back to it? So if I've got 90 items to backlog or to prioritize my backlog, right? I want to do this exercise. If I've got a conflict happening right there and it's just the amount of effort, fine. I'm going to go with high effort. I might mark that, and I might use it in a refinement conversation later to break that down a little bit more, or go get some answers to it. So
Gotcha.
if you have a conflict on both dimensions, you may want to pull that out until you get more clarity on what you're asking. But if you just got a conflict around effort, I probably would go with high and then mark that for more refinement, because you don't want to spend your time when you're prioritizing problem solving. Does that help?
Yep, thank you.
Yeah. There's something around that effort conversation. Actually, when you start moving into the Scrum Agile planning, this is one of those first touches that people get. They're not even putting sizing on it at this point. They're really just comparing. So that could be another way that you think about resolving that conflict, is finding something else and comparing it, right? Like on the fly, if you've got 90, 100 items to prioritize and you want to spend more than, say, 2 hours doing it, you might think about what's a comparison story and how can I compare one against the other? Or you can make an assumption. If it's this, then it's low effort. But if it's that, then it's high effort. But I would mark those down. And the idea with prioritization is just keep on going, right? Get through them all, because that comparison that we're doing visually is a really good way to level set each other and have those conversations. So that was a great question. Can you see that happening and having those comparison conversations?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Or if not, mark it, go conservative, mark it, and then go get some more data.
Well, I'm thinking too, Julie, now that you mentioned that, to your point, Blair, there's also sort of if it's not something we can answer easily, part of that effort in my mind is the debate of what this will actually take. Therefore, it is presumed to be a higher level of effort because we haven't decided. like that act of deciding what's going on is counted inherently in the effort level.
Like a, do you mean like a research story?
Yeah, I think so. And if there's more research that needs to be done to decide how much effort it would be, that would automatically kind of bump it up a step.
Yeah, that's a great point. We often will size things with points in Agile. Are you guys using points? Yeah. So it's a pretty common thing. I mean, as a consultant, I get paid in hours. So I prefer hours. That's just me. But if you are using points, we like that little acronym: complexity, uncertainty, and effort. So Q, C, U, and E. Complexity, uncertainty, and effort. And so if I really can't get a good, I'm not going to say accuracy because we're not looking for accuracy, but if I can't get a good confidence given those three things, then I'm probably going to pull that out and do some more research as a product owner, as a business person, in order to give my team more data, and then I'll have them look at that again. So if there's a question about any one of those three elements, complexity, uncertainty, or effort, we would go high. So that's a good point, to your point about that. Any other adds on this? So you would use this when you want the collective wisdom of the group, especially when you've got a lot of stuff. Visualization, you could visualize hundreds of items this way because you're starting to compare one against the other. These are not absolute. This is relative sizing, really, relative value, if you will, that we use a lot in agility, kind of like planning poker or using points. We're just comparing one against the other. So an easy way to get a lot of items into a grid. And you don't need fancy tools to do this. This is just, if you were in person, obviously we would encourage a whiteboard, but you could use it online using something as simple as a PowerPoint. If you can share like through Google Slides and everybody can move things, that would be better. If you can't share, I would send it to people beforehand so that they can make their opinions without being influenced by others. And then you would just talk about where your opinions don't match. You don't need to talk about all 90 items. If you've got the same items in each quadrant except for 2 or 3, you would just talk about the ones that you don't agree upon. So it really makes your prioritization conversations a little bit leaner because you're only talking about the areas that you disagree. Now, what if all of those 90 items are in a list and you have next to them, high impact, low effort, high effort, high impact? How valuable would be a rank ordered list with these elements categorized versus a visualization? Could you do it?
Visualization would be way better.
The visualization is better, yeah. Now you could, if you were to do this and then you're putting it in your tool, are you guys using a workflow tool like a Jira or anything like that? Yes?
Largely GitHub.
Okay, so you could use these quadrants as value categories, and you could kind of build your shorthand out with a tag or a custom field, and then you could sort. Because that's what you got to get to, right? This stuff has to go into a rank ordered list. And so you may then start to organize your work in multiple ways when you're in Scrum, because you might have things with epics or features, you might have some defects or some keeping the lights on stuff that has to happen in the same sprint. So once you do this exercise, it has to go into a rank ordered list. You want to carry these values through by using a tag or using some kind of element inside your tool so you don't lose this conversation. So sometimes people have categories of value. It could be as simple as an acronym or an ABCD or something like that to remember this prioritization conversation. Maybe they even use a numeric number, like everything that's in the upper left is a 100, this is a 50, that's a 25. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It just matters that you have this conversation and then you carry that conversation over into your backlog. Because when you are under a crisis and you have even more limited time than you thought, you could use this value number, right, to identify what has to happen versus everything else. You don't have to keep having the same conversation over and over again because you've had it, you've marked it, you've carried it over. That transparency is known to everyone. And would that number change over time? Could it change over time? Sure. What would make it change? More something. More data. More data will help you, but might change these values, right? Maybe there's new technology that comes out that drastically reduces the effort. Or maybe somebody is now an expert in something and it drastically reduces the uncertainty. So as you go through your Agile refinement sessions, those numbers can change, and this visualization makes it really, really easy to do that. So even though you start with this visualization, it's got to go into your rank order list. So don't lose this. Don't lose these categories. Just find a shorthand or find a rank, find some kind of symbol or acronym or something that you can carry over. Everybody good with that? All right. Does everybody have this marked on their matrix? Okay, there's a ton of matrix out there. One that's really often used, I worked in data for a long time, and so feasibility and impact is a matrix that we often use. So we might be comparing, can I get that data? Feasibility of getting that data versus impact. That might be a way you can make up your own matrix. That's really what it is. And of course, as a consultant, every consultant wants their own matrix. But matrices are a really good way to visualize things. Right? So often people say, well, I always go with the upper right quadrant. I always go with like this little diagram, so it goes with the upper left. It doesn't matter to me. It matters to me that you're having the conversation. Which quadrant is lending itself to your backlog, to the problem that you're trying to solve? So there's a ton of them. There's probably a whole book about there. I was doing a little bit of research and I found this one. This one is something that somebody made. I really loved it. In fact, I might try this with my own backlog with the product that we're building back in our shop. So I think I mentioned this, to determine first what's the problem that you're trying to solve, make up your own matrix, and then visualize your thinking. So that's our takeaways with matrices. Let's go through this one. He's calling this a 5x5. He or she is calling this a 5x5 matrix to help assess stories and ethics. So across the top, he's got that, how much would it cost to implement? So that's that effort, right? In Scrum, if you've got a sustainable team, cost and time are really the same number because you've got a cost of a sprint. And I love these little images. What are these images telling us?
Relative scale.
Relative scale, right? Without putting a number on it, it's just a relative scale. Now, what about down the left? What would you bet that Epic or Story X has value for the user? And he's highlighted that word bet. Let's talk about that. What's your impression of that?
It's an educated guess, an assumption.
Yeah, and I really love this term, this idea of using this term bet. We're placing a bet in our backlog that this thing that we're building is of value, because it's completely ambiguous until we get it out there in the hands of whoever's using it. It's just a guess. So it's just this likelihood of success based on whatever you know at the time. It could also be a little bit of a confidence check, because making something like this is, you're visualizing it. So you might be having those known and unknown conversations. He's added in another dimension with color. So build it, upper right, obvious, we're going to build it. Bottom left, right, do more research. So if you can imagine, this is probably a blank matrix. You're pulling stuff over into all these different categories. And at the end, you can just add this color coding, and you've got a pretty good idea of the things that you can do right now that build it, the things you might do parallel, so prototype something while you're going through it. And then maybe those red things they're later. You might have to do a little bit more research or breaking them down a little bit more. There's one more element on this chart I want to pull out. Can everybody read this? Is it clear enough to read what this says up here? The company's money versus your money. Has anybody ever thought about it like that? If you're really thinking like, if it were my money, what would I do? That puts a little bit different spin on it, right? And so if you've got clients who have limited amount of money, this can be a really valuable conversation, even if you're just doing this internally. If it were my money, what would I do? There's a lot of prioritization games out there about using money, using fake money, like Monopoly money. Everybody gets a certain amount of money, and you're you're applying your own money to what you think this investment is worth. So that could be a way to combine those conversations. With that, going back to our matrix, how are you doing? Does everybody have, so far you've gotten through the Hippo was already done, and then the next one was Moscow. Now we're on to matrices. Does everybody have those three? Okay, we're going to move on to one that I might be one of my favorites. Kano was really attributed to a Japanese professor named Kano. Obviously, I can't remember his first name. I'm going to say something like Noriyako or something like that. I'm probably butchering it. But Kano is his professor's name. And he did this as a result of needing to categorize a bunch of data like what you would get from user surveys. So think about that when we get to our discussion question. Remember that conversation that everything is a priority, right? For me, A, I like the visualization. B, I like the user side of it. But 3, I really like the ability to prioritize things on multiple dimensions. And so these 3 have risen to the surface. Customer delighters, that's those things that your customers don't expect, but that really, after they get them, they really delight them. The satisfiers, I call these the numbers, the revenue makers, the cost savers, the things that really satisfy our users or our customers' needs. And then basic expectations. And that might be that technology runway that you have to build as well. So 3 different dimensions here. And as you go through, you would organize, just like on any other matrix, you would organize your backlog on these 3 different dimensions. This also pulls away from just thinking about ROI. So, you know, sometimes I'll do an exercise where we will order our backlog just by return on investment, just by money, kind of like that Moscow method. But what happens at those customer delighters, since we don't know, they're not actually resulting in money, or we don't know what those customer delighters will do, they often get dropped to the end. And even if I'm working with an organization where they're dealing with, maybe I'm dealing with something outside of software like HR or recruiting or marketing, right? My customer delighters might be more around employee engagement or culture questions. So I'm thinking of my customers in that instance as employees. So this kind of a exercise, this model is just allowing me this multi-dimensional view of my backlog, and I can place things on each of these. So let's talk about just a couple of them. Anybody, does anybody have an anecdote that comes to mind? I've got a couple, but before I get into mine, does anybody have an anecdote of something that you bought or used recently that really had some feature that really delighted you that you didn't know was gonna be part of that product? I recently bought an outdoor fan. I live in Florida now. I bought a fan that is waterproof. I bought it intentionally because it's waterproof, and I didn't know until after we bought it that it could be controlled through your phone. So imagine that we dash in with one of our famous, you know, thunderstorms, and we want to turn the fan off. I can turn it off from the comfort of my home. I didn't even know that I was going to get that. I was pretty delighted about that. So kind of now performance, these satisfier here is this blue line, this performance line. Those are typically things like you pay more, you get more. So anybody ever paid more for like a bigger hotel room? Right? So in your product backlog, you could put some satisfiers in there that people might have to pay more for in order to get. So even if you're thinking about data storage or workflow steps, different tools that you're using, there's a lot of things that could land on the satisfier line that people are willing to pay more in order to get more. And then there's those basic expectations. Basic expectations, I would put that, like Moscow, I would put that under the must-have. That means that if you don't have this in your product or in the service that you're building, people will not use it. So imagine a car without brakes. So it's a simple, that's probably too simple of an example, but that's what we're talking about with basic expectations. So let's apply this to real life. 9 months ago, a delighter for a grocery store, even backing up, once Amazon bought Whole Foods, a delighter would have been what? When we think about grocery stores a year ago.
Grocery delivery.
Grocery delivery. What has happened to that delighter as of March in the United States?
Kind of required.
Satisfier. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, it's at least a satisfier. I'll pay more in order to get it. In some demographics or in some products, it might be a basic expectation. In order to compete, they may have had to make that delivery free. Right? Mostly my groceries, I pay more to get it. Right? And what about food delivery? Has anybody ordered more food delivery? Do you pay more to get it faster?
You.
Yeah, my Uber Eats, like my big weakness, if I'm feeling crappy, it's pho. Everybody knows it. It's like my big weakness. If I'm eating pho, I had a rough day and I want my pho hot. So I will pay for priority to delivery so that I can get it faster. I'm the first one on the drop off. I don't even know if that's true, but since I'm seeing that little, thing moving along in Uber Eats, I'm assuming it's true. So over time and given a market condition, satisfiers could become basic expectations. Delighters can become basic expectations. So this is a living prioritization model. You want to probably bring this up every time you're having a release because things might have shifted, right? So it's just a way to kind of keep that user experience in mind. And thinking of that, what kind of data would this require?
Still seems kind of qualitative.
It could be somewhat qualitative, correct? Yep. You could be guessing, but can you measure satisfaction? Has anybody gotten one of those surveys after you ordered your food online? Yeah, satisfaction is a pretty common user data, right? And this was really, Kano model was really invented as a result of surveys, customer surveys, a way to visualize these different dimensions as a result of customer surveys. So given that, when would be the best time to use this model?
After a release.
After a release, it would be great, right? You really want to understand what's happening to the thing that you just delivered. Could you do that? Could you use Kano on something that is in discovery? You're just figuring it out. You haven't actually released it?
Sure. Yeah.
You could.
Yeah. Good way to.
Yeah, keep going. Would be a quick way to.
I was gonna say it'd be a good way to figure out if something's even viable, if it's going to work, or if you need to dump it and start over.
Yeah. And how would you do that, Dan?
I mean, you could try it maybe with your product owner or with a smaller team and just see if it works.
Yeah, absolutely. You could just even get a little bit of your sphere of influence in there. Real customers are always best, but in absence of real customers, get the people who are closest to your customers and just walk through it, right? And then start applying this. So this is another good one to use when you have a ton of stuff that you need to order. It's a great one to use when you have a ton of survey data. Could you switch these 3 dimensions out for something else that fits the problem you're trying to solve? Sure. What if basic expectations was regulatory or compliance items? What if it was those must-haves, legal stuff, EPA regulations? That's going to happen no matter what, right? What would be a customer delighter in your world? Anybody have an example of something you've delivered that really delighted your users?
One of our products had, just found out yesterday, had always shown one location of, an incident, but we added a new item that they could track and find, and when they found that they could see that on a map, they were really excited about it. That was kind of cool to hear.
That's very cool. I love that. I really love when we have reviews and people really show their excitement about something. So even if you have that absence of data, Having somebody at your review really paying attention to customers' reactions, to users' reactions when you're showing them something, particularly when we are remote, you don't have people in the room, you know, ask people to go off camera so you can see their facial expressions, you can see if you're keeping their attention. You might do a little, you know, a fun little voting game or something at the end. But even when you've got remote reviews, you want to see people's initial reactions. So you might ask them, you know, to simulate what you would have in the room, because you can tell when you're in a physical face-to-face review, you can tell the excitement when somebody sees something that is really solving a problem for them. Whether or not it's making money for them or you, if you can solve the problem, you're adding value. And that often relates back to repeat business. So I wanted to show you a couple of things on this. If you were to put your backlog against it, right? Again, something visual, so you can keep critiquing your thinking. You don't want to straddle any lines, get people to commit to a quadrant, because that really helps. Which quadrant would you build your backlog from?
It seems like we would want a slice of from each of those lines in that top right quadrant.
Nicely done. Yes, yes, indeed. So just pretend you have a piece of paper and start pulling it over to the right, so that now you have a balanced portfolio. You have at least one delighter, you have some satisfiers, and you have those things that must be there in order for it to be done. Now, this is an absolute. Once you start to narrow down your list, you might have some more of those basics, right? You might have some more of that technological runway that you have to build in order to land the plane. But what it starts to do is starts to get the noise out of the backlog, so that now you have a much more limited amount of items that you need to prioritize at this point in time. So brilliant, David. We're looking for that slice. No, oh, go back to your matrix. Everybody mark that on your matrix. How much data and how easy is it? I'll give you a second to do that. Anybody heard of heart metrics? You are a consumer of heart metrics if you use any product online of any big name. You can see on this slide, this really came out of Google, being a data company. They really took a look at different types of data and how they could use data to prioritize their backlog. Now, they are a data company, but they're applying it to the user experience. So it's multidimensional. It's driven by a ton of data. The idea is that you don't do all of these, but you find some things that are important for you and the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, you've probably all had some kind of survey or questionnaire or something from different experiences in your life that related to some of these. So going down these, I won't read them all out, but the happiness meter, how you feel about something. That's those pretty easy. That's those net promoter score surveys, right? Like, give me from 1 to 10, how likely are you to use this product again? Give me a 1 to 5 on my Uber Eats order, right? They're just gauging at a very, very high level how you feel about their product, maybe even how easy it was to use. Are you guys using any of these? Are you thinking about new users, returning users, behavioral metrics?
Absolutely.
Which ones come to mind for your problem set?
The frequency, engagement.
Okay, tell me more about that.
One of the projects we're working on is it's a national project that is really important for the users to be engaged. Working through, as I've described it, making it sticky so that the users need to come back and
Nice.
wanting to come back.
So what kind of data are you collecting in order to get evidence of that?
Frequency of use, how long that they're on the site, how often they come back.
Great. Are you
Google
able to
Analytics.
slice and dice between different features or different pages?
Yes, and
Nice.
apps and widgets.
Nice, very well, that's great, fantastic. And so sometimes they're easy, they're very straightforward, and sometimes sounds like you might be combining some of them as well. And that's what we see when we look at Facebook. Facebook has that pretty famous, if I can get 7 users to, I'm sorry, if I can get a user to friend 7 people in 10 days. That's a sticky user for Facebook. So a new user, that's fine for them, but they're caring more about some of those behavioral or interaction metrics. So they want to see if a user will friend 7 people in 10 days. If that happens, they know they have a pretty sticky user. You might use even features of this. I think I mentioned this since it's coming from Google. Things like, does anybody here have Gmail? Anybody using the label feature in Gmail? So that's something that they measure if you're using some of those features in Gmail. Sort of the famous funny story about the little paperclip in the Microsoft products. Does everybody remember the little paperclip guy?
Clippy.
Clippy, right?
Well.
Like sort of the classic, classic joke. But somebody thought that was a big idea, right? And it just has sort of become this sort of the synonym for a useless feature. So that's why, you looking at these different ways, love that you're doing some of that, thinking about that, introducing that as a prioritization, making sure that the things in your backlog are relating back to the problem that you're trying to solve. So if, for example, you're trying to choose between something that is around those behavioral metrics that you're talking about, was that Michael, versus something else like it's just a good idea, or I'm already in the code so I want to do it, or it's really easy so I want to fill up my backlog, could you see how aligning your prioritization with your organizational goals would help prioritization?
Yep.
All right, when would we use this? When would you use heart metrics?
We even have sort of 2 different circumstances. One, ArcGIS Online builds some of these stats automatically. So like who's viewing your app, how frequently, I can't remember if there are how many different users, but there's been some of those circumstances where maybe we have a internal map or a public map and it's like, oh, nobody's been looking, maybe one person asked for an update, but otherwise, nobody's looking at it on a daily basis or monthly basis, versus some products where we got 100 people looking at it every day. Yeah, this is something we should take care of really quickly.
Nice. I love that.
So there's some products like that.
Yeah, that's great. These are the types of conversations. If you can start drawing some parallels between items in your backlog and how they will apply to the goals that you're trying to do, you will find it as a really good prioritization tool. And even if you use it as a retro, if you went back and said, how much of my backlog is applying to these organizational or these product objectives, that might be a really good lessons learned to see. Is 25% of your backlog applying to something that you're measuring, that you're using to make decisions? Is 10%? Is 80%? That could be an interesting conversation that might lend itself to a pivot or some kind of product decision. The other thing I want to point out is around this retention, this who does not proceed. We talk about this in terms of sort of survival metrics. So thinking, I think Jenny, you were alluding to like features not being used. Do you guys kill off features or software that's not being used?
Not easily.
Yeah,
No,
never
what
easy.
if someone wants to use it?
Right. What if somebody goes into that kitchen junk drawer and finds that elastic band that's in the back right corner, right? That old chopstick that's sitting in there. Now you guys are finding out what's in my junk drawer. So this idea of figuring out what people are not using and then literally making the decision to kill it, because anything that you're maintaining is costing you. Even if it's data, the cost of keeping data and then duplicating it over, a couple of different sites can be enormously expensive. But we're like electronic hoarders. We hoard everything. But if you have features that nobody's using and you're thinking about that total cost of ownership, what does it cost to maintain this thing? What does it cost? In old days, in some respects, it was kind of simpler. I don't know if any of you were coding when the internet was coming on the scene and every browser had different standards and you had to choose which browsers you were going to support. Did anybody live through that nightmare?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was a nightmare. You literally had to have a short list of which browsers your stuff would work in. So much easier now. I know it's not universal, but there's so much more sharing of the standards now that it makes it a little bit easier. But in the beginning, in some respects, it made it a little bit easier because you had to define what you were going to support, and you couldn't support everything. So sometimes technology overruns us, and it makes our choices almost too broad. So that could be an option. So this is a very important percentage when we talk about product metrics versus delivery metrics. When we're thinking about successful product metrics, understanding what people are using and where to spend your investment, where to put your bets, is a very important prioritization technique. So we want to keep that at the top of our mind. And I just want to relate to this idea of like when, even in wartime, when they were analyzing the airplanes that were coming back and where they were showing evidence of bullets or being shot, and these airplanes that were coming back, so that they could strengthen the airplanes and make sure that people could survive by analyzing where the bullets were going all the way through, the outside of the airplane. What was wrong with that strategy?
They were being reactive, not proactive.
And they were analyzing the ones that had already survived. It would have been more valuable to analyze the ones that didn't survive, right? To find out what actually took down a plane. And so that's this idea of survivor metrics. So don't just look at the people who are using your product. Look at the people who've abandoned your product or who have abandoned a process or a system. And you want to find out what's making them abandon that. We do this a lot in e-commerce because you can see that conversion rate, right? So if you've got stuff in your cart but you don't buy it for some reason, you might do a survey or some observations just about that point in time. So I was working for a furniture company, for example. They had the trucking infrastructure to deliver anywhere in the domestic United States in 2 days or less. And yet, what would happen is people would put stuff in their shopping cart. Their conversion rate was in the single digits, and a typical conversion rate is somewhere in the teens. When they went to buy the furniture, even face to face, even when they were in the store and they went to buy the furniture, they would find out that the average time of delivery was 17 days. Now, you got Thanksgiving coming up. You want to buy a new couch. You pick out your new couch. You find out you're not going to get that for 17 days. Could that be a pretty strong reason for abandoning your cart? Yeah, and so sometimes just finding out why people are abandoning things, it's not going to give you the direct answer, but in this company, what we found is they had the capability to deliver it, but in the realm of efficiency, not effectiveness, efficiency, they were packing their trucks 5 days in advance. So if you're packing your truck 5 days in advance, at the very soonest, how fast could you deliver something? 5 days, right? That's the very soonest. Even though they had the infrastructure to be able to deliver it anywhere in 2 days or less, the very soonest they could deliver is 5 days. So this was an interesting metric to unpack and really understand what was happening behind the scenes, why people were abandoning, this furniture store's purchase. Now, it's interesting. They are one of the largest furniture makers in the United States, and they use a lot of distribution centers. They will wholesale to other furniture stores. So not only do they have their own furniture store, but they use a lot of distributors. So when I asked them who their user is, they would tell me it's their distributors. This is an interesting case, right? Is their user really the distributor? If I want to furnish my new house and I don't buy that couch, and 1,000 of my closest friends stop buying that couch, who goes out of business? My client or their distributors? My client, right? It's not the distributor. The distributor will just pick up another furniture line. So this is an interesting conversation. I live in Tampa. We are in a world of B2B, lots of B2B businesses, hospitality, fintech, lots of fintech, hospitality, those types of home offices. I guess our tax structures must be set up for that. So we consider ourselves kind of experts in this B2B space. And so people will always tell me that their customer is this business, but that's not your end user, right? You have to be really clear about who your user is versus your customer. And what will happen if your user stops using your service or buying your product? Who goes out of business? So when we're thinking about these HARP metrics, this is a way to use these metrics in a way to prioritize your items and thinking about what you can do with your limited time and effort. Any adds to this? You could use this with clickable prototypes. You could use this, to really dig more into engagement things. So if you are finding some abandonment, if you're not getting the kind of usage or adoption that you're looking for, I would up my game in these areas, and maybe thinking about combining a couple of those. So they may not be straightforward. They may take more time, but really think about that problem that you're trying to solve. Okay, does everybody go ahead?
Oh, well, just a question too. I'm thinking too, I don't know if this is necessarily the best use case, but I know sometimes we're getting called in to rebuild either old technology or, another, not necessarily a company's product, but just something, especially at EPA, somebody else at the agency built it, it's 20 years old, it's time to update it, bring it into 2020. And I'm just thinking too, maybe using some of these questions could help us. Like, I think sometimes we dance around those questions of what didn't you like, not wanting to kind of harp on the negative. But I'm just thinking too, some of this would be more helpful to sit down and say, be brutally honest. Why did you stop using that, or why are you turning away from this? And I think sometimes that's hard to get straight answers to.
Yes. Yes, Andy.
But valuable.
Yes. You have to be ruthless. Competition is getting more and more fierce, and also we often think about main competitors when we're thinking about staying ahead of the game, but we often overlook the lean startup community. And the lean startups do not have to deal with the same kind of business day-to-day, keeping the lights on stuff that bigger companies or more established companies have to do. And they can erode your market value little by little. They can start pulling people away by just putting one little fun feature out there, or one little, cool little AI thing. And they start eroding your customer base. So getting that ruthless feedback and cutting off, and thinking about everything that you have out there that you're maintaining as an investment, and thinking about limited time and money and what you have to kill and where you have to pivot, you really have to be intentionally ruthless about that. And the best way to do that is with data, not with opinions, right? It's not the Hippo in that case, because one loud voice on social media is not data. It's highly impactful, but it's not data, right? So data can definitely be your friend, particularly when you're thinking about where you need to pivot. That's a great ad. So go ahead and put this on your matrix. How much data, how much effort. Then just a little reminder, you don't need to use them all. Just find the ones that meet the problem that you're trying to solve. Okay, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on cost of delay. This one, I'm not sure who actually invented it, but cost of delay is attributed to Don Reinerstein, who wrote the Principles of Product Development. He's really an expert, one of the first experts who really wrote a lot about flow. And a lot of this is really behind a lot of what you see in the scaled Agile world. So Don Reinerstein's The Principles of Product Development. And what he says is the one thing that should be quantified is the cost of delay. It's the golden key. The cost of delay unlocks many doors, and it has this astonishing power to change the mindset of an organization. So that's how powerful cost of delay can be. Let's just talk about this. Does anybody use this or is familiar with cost of delay?
I haven't, but a similar term I think is technical debt. I'm very familiar with that, and I feel like that can kind of play into here.
Yeah, tell me more.
Yeah, so if you have an easy solution to a problem that you can do in an hour, but then a year later you have to revisit it and fix it kind of quote unquote the right way, it takes more work to do it, to fix it quickly the wrong way first and then repair it later than it does to do it the right way up front.
I think that's a true statement, yes. The cost of delay is really typically related to receiving your revenue or your value. But I think that your conversation around technical debt is 100% directly applied to that, because it'll impede this ability to get to value or to revenue. Agree, disagree?
Yeah, I think so. And I think especially in development, developing software or solutions that happens a lot. And it's hard to, it's hard to argue with a client who says, just do it this way, because we want it done now and you can do it quickly in the back of your head. Or sometimes even you tell them, straight up, that, hey, there's a better way of doing it that's going to be a benefit to you in the long run. Sometimes that's a hard conversation to have and get through.
Can you?
I guess usually I feel comfortable having that conversation as long as you can kind of point it out and say, hey, in a year from now when we're redoing this because we made this decision today, I at least feel better about it knowing that I pointed that out.
Yes. I'm yes-anding you. Could you
Yeah.
quantify that? Could you quantify what that cost could be?
I'm sure you could. I'm sure you could say, we can do it today for X amount of hours, quote unquote, the wrong way. And we could do it the right way for, Y amount of hours and show them the cost it would, what would they save up front, but then try to quantify how would that cost them in the end. I mean, that's hard to do, but yeah, you could take a shot at it, I think.
Yeah, it is hard to do, but how valuable is it when you could actually quantify what you could do instead of dealing with that technical debt? If you could literally quantify, let's use an example. I was working with a company, their code, they had spaghetti code. I couldn't release anything without affecting like 6 other teams' stuff. So we literally mapped it out and you could see this just crazy code. So we started decoupling these little features so that we could actually update something without affecting everybody's, world. And it was really difficult to get the stakeholders to understand I needed to take this team offline in order to decouple this code. And so we started doing things like automation and some other stuff to help improve and get rid of some of that technical debt. I think it was a 14-year-old company. We used some kind of software and they came out with this number that said we had 44 years of technical debt. It was strangling us. Now, it's interesting. The sales department would say that this ability that they had, this is an insurance company, the ability that they had to customize for every single client was their competitive advantage. This is a true story. They said that customizing for every client was their competitive advantage. And yet they had 44 years of technical debt. So can you guys, what would the technologists say about their competitive advantage? Would they agree that customization for every client is a competitive advantage? No, we were like this. It was like they were at loggerheads. It's an $85 million debt-free company, brilliant business case. And 2 years later, they were still dealing with the same problem because they really couldn't wrap their head around how to get past this crushing technical debt. They, really ended up changing their whole C-suite and finding somebody to modernize that platform in order to get over that hump. Because technical debt will literally drown you. You'll get to a point where you cannot scale and you cannot sustain something, especially with new technology platforms. So very, very valid point. Thank you for that, Derek. So if you can take that conversation and quantify it, that's what Dawn is saying is really the conversation changer. It's the mindset changer. So you qualify what matters and then you quantify it because you've got to speak their language. So if I weren't doing this, I would have this much time in order to do that, right? That's how businesses operate, dollars and cents. You got to put things in a, whatever matters to them. If it's time, if I weren't maintaining this customer base, I could do this. If it's limited time, if that's what they care about, then quantify your time savings. If it's, I can't support this very, very valuable user base because I'm too busy supporting this very complex small one, that 80-20 rule, if that's what they care about, then you would quantify that. And that's really the concept behind cost of delay. So as a product person, you're constantly evaluating if I am prioritizing something and I can get it out there, even if it's not perfect, it can be making money, saving money, or delighting the customer while I'm getting the next release ready. So I'll give you a couple of real life anecdotes. I was working with a huge company up in New York City. One feature was a workflow feature that would save their analysts a ton of time and a number of steps so that their analysts could be freed up to do more valuable work. It's very repetitive stuff. The other feature was to build this algorithm, this automated algorithm around some pricing and credit conversations that would really reduce their liability in order to make this credit rating. So one was around saving time for analysts, and one was liability. Now, anybody have, what would you choose? You're trying to use business agility principles. Which one would you choose? How would you go about it? They're both valuable on the surface, right? Could you quantify them?
Yeah, I mean, you can quantify the amount of time saved, and you can quantify the liability.
Absolutely, you can quantify them. Maybe not down to a dollar, but generally speaking. And so doing just a little bit of analysis, we could identify how much time would be saved with this workflow system versus the idea of the dollars. They could be sued if they got even one credit rating wrong. And it was when we started thinking about that cost of delay, what we realized is that we could deal with this algorithm. Now, we weren't telling the analysts we were never going to get to it. It was just for the next 3 months, while we were dealing with the algorithm, they were going to keep doing business their own way. So now we were extrapolating out just 3 months of this workflow kludginess, right? And so it was a much easier business sell to prioritize this algorithm over the workflow because they knew it was just going to be for 3 months. When the next release came out, we were going to start dealing with that workflow issue. And so going back to that very first slide when we're talking about everybody, making all the stakeholders happy, thinking about slicing your work, cost of delay can be a game changer because we weren't asking the analysts to wait for a year. We were asking them to wait to the second release. And that changed the math considerably when we're talking about, 100 analysts over the course of 3 months. And this was a pattern that they did maybe once a week versus doing it over the course of a year or 2 years, because we just needed 3 months to go deal with this algorithm, right? And then we were pretty good about doing the things we said we were going to do. We had that intentional ecosystem in place. We were uninterrupted. That's a very big part of Scrum is you build out your priorities and you stick with them. You finish what you've started, and building that trust by being able to deliver that. So cost of delay is a critical piece when you're trying to make these big game decisions and then speaking in the language of the customer that you're dealing with, right? What do they care about? It might be dollars, but cost might be effort. It might be culture. It might be adoption. Did we kind of see how this comes into play? When would you use this in your life? When would you use cost of delay? Do you ever have choices between alternatives that you have to choose?
I'm thinking even some of this stuff, some of the internal innovate tools we've built like Spock, that either somebody manually does these spreadsheets forever, or we invest a little bit and get the tools we need so that this isn't somebody's job to put so many hours a week into anymore. It's just there and ready.
Yeah, I love that. Do you ever deal with MVPs, like doing a small chunk of something to validate an assumption or to get something out there to solve a problem quickly?
Yeah.
Yeah, so cost of delay can be a very, very important part of that. Even if you have to chunk stuff up. So one insurance company, for example, they wanted to build a new product with a brand new UX. They wanted to get their quoting time down from 10 minutes to 3 minutes. Now I'm used to those Geico commercials. I thought 15 minutes was the standard, but their competitor was giving quotes, property insurance quotes in 3 minutes. And their current quoting time was 10 minutes. And the agents were telling them, I can't sell your product because I don't have time to quote it. I can't buy time. And so they really wanted to get their quoting system down to 3 minutes. So we were testing out a user experience that was saving something like 45 clicks, sometimes in one view, because they were really improving. If you've ever bought property insurance, you have to put in what kind of roof you have, what kind of, do you have any asbestos, how close is your, fire hydrant, all these things around it. And by improving the UX in one set of tests, they were able to really reduce that user input complexity. At the same time, they were building out this first use case and this first release of just improving the UX. That cut their coding time from 10 minutes to something like 6 minutes. While they were doing that, they were procuring some software that allowed them to start doing those elastic streets where you start typing in a street and then it will fill in the rest, right? That bought them another minute, right? So while they were doing one release, they were procuring software for the next release. They were also doing things like adding in APIs to reduce the response time coming back from a mainframe server. So there were things that were happening throughout the releases, that each release was reducing time. And every time they were able to release something, they were getting more agents using this. If they waited until the end, until 6 months into the end, then they would never be able to get something out there. Everybody following that? So sometimes it's hard. If you're allergic to numbers, I love this. I took this off of Black Swan Farming, who's got a lot of information about cost of delay. They do a great job of showing how to have this conversation in, yet again, a matrix. So building a matrix and then just fleshing it out with your impressions around what it would look like. So even if you don't have the data, you could use a matrix and start thinking about that, and then you can go get the data, particularly if it's high risk. So real quick, to add this to your matrix. I think we're pretty much at the end of our time, right? We're close to the end of our time. I want to show you the key. Last thing while you're just finishing up your matrix, and then I'll show you your key. A lot of times we make emotional decisions, especially if you've got that hippo in the room. The best way you can do that is show some logic, show some data. So give people that story that connects them with the why, be transparent about them, but then give them that data, those information and facts that help rationalize that decision. It really helps those hippos to move to thinking like your customers. So stop thinking about your customers and start thinking like your customers. All right, real quick, let's do our key. We had Hippo up there at the top, right? Pretty much an opinion, pretty easy to do. Anybody have Moscow in this place? Yeah, very qualitative, yep. Right? Not too hard. You can probably get a group of people together wanting to start to feel like you get multiple perceptions. What about heart matrix? Close to here, a lot more data, a little bit more effort.
Yep.
Pretty valuable, but definitely an investment. The Kano model. Yep. Effort impact matrix, kind of in the middle there. I like this one a lot because you can do a little bit with a lot, get lots of different people's opinions, use that when you want to get other people to give you those inputs. And then cost of delay. How'd you guys do? Pretty good? Ultimately, it doesn't really matter. Go ahead.
Pretty good.
Yeah, ultimately it doesn't really matter. It matters that you start doing it, but have a constructive conversation and use the right one to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. And then think in your mind, which one of these is the riskiest. So if you are landing in this upper left quite a bit, you want to start moving down towards your bottom right if you need to resolve some risk. Data is going to be a friend. Great product people, use data. And that's it. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for the conversation. You'll get this deck. There's a ton of resources here, some fun books here. Feel free to stay in touch. My information is in this deck as well. Let me know. Love to hear how these have worked for you and any problems that you're trying to solve.
Well, Julie, thank you so much for walking through this. This is really great stuff. For the Innovate team, please just note this in your timesheet as training. If you need the code, please reach out to Amanda for that. Love to have some more discussion about this. Maybe we can have a follow-up discussion with the team at our check-in call we have with the offsite developers. So, want to be cognizant of people's time. So have a great day, guys. And thank you again so very much, Julie. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you, Julie.
Thanks.